Congresswoman, I want to start with something simple. That was the first sentence Ted Cruz delivered when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez settled into the witness chair before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee, and she answered the moment with the kind of polished smile that usually works perfectly when the cameras are already rolling. She had spent years mastering the rhythm of social media, cable news confrontation, carefully framed clips, and direct-to-camera speeches where she controlled the setting, the timing, and often the final word. But this room offered none of those conveniences. On the table in front of Cruz sat a yellow legal pad turned face down, hiding 4 handwritten items she could not see. 4 questions or pressure points arranged in an order only he knew, and that simple detail gave the exchange its entire structure before the first serious challenge had even arrived. Ocasio-Cortez adjusted the microphone, faced the cameras, and carried herself like someone walking into familiar territory, except there was one brutal difference between a live stream and a congressional hearing. There was no block button, no edit, no swipe, and no way to make the next question disappear. Cruz flipped the legal pad over and began with accountability, asking whether taxpayer money should be traceable when the government spends it, a question so basic that refusing it would have been politically impossible. Ocasio-Cortez agreed immediately, saying accountability was fundamental to good governance, exactly the kind of clean answer that sounds impressive because nobody in the room disagrees with it. Cruz then tightened the frame, asking whether a member of Congress proposing a massive spending program should be able to tell Americans what that program would cost, and suddenly the harmless civics lesson became something much more specific. Ocasio-Cortez tried to widen the answer into investment, future generations, and the cost of doing nothing, but Cruz refused to follow her into the language of abstraction and reduce the issue to a yes or no proposition. She finally agreed, and in that moment she had accepted the standard Cruz was preparing to use against her. Then he asked for the number. What would the Green New Deal cost the American taxpayer? Ocasio-Cortez responded with the familiar language surrounding the proposal, talking about communities left behind, clean air, clean water, workers, and a just transition. But none of those phrases contained the figure Cruz had requested. He tapped the pen once and asked again for a number in dollars, because the entire point of the exchange was not whether the proposal sounded compassionate, ambitious, or transformative, but whether the person identified with it could price it. She still did not give him one, and the absence became more damaging than almost any number could have been because 90 seconds earlier she had agreed that lawmakers should understand the cost of what they propose. Cruz did not need to accuse her of inconsistency. He simply placed her own standard beside her own inability to satisfy it and let the contrast do the work. He moved to one piece of the Green New Deal, the call for retrofitting buildings across the United States to meet new energy efficiency standards within a decade, and narrowed the debate from trillion-dollar slogans to arithmetic. Using the figures presented in the original script, he cited roughly 130 million buildings and an average retrofit cost of about $50,000, producing a figure of approximately $6.5 trillion for the building component alone. He emphasized that this did not include the jobs programs, healthcare provisions, income guarantees, or the other ambitions associated with the broader proposal, only the buildings, and that distinction made the number harder to escape. His Princeton versus MIT crack was controlled rather than theatrical, because the joke worked only after the multiplication had already been placed on the table. The attack was straightforward. If one line could reach trillions and the sponsor could not state the overall price, then the public was being asked to endorse something dangerously close to a blank check. Cruz then reached beneath the legal pad and produced the original FAQ document released alongside the Green New Deal resolution, the document that included the phrase providing economic security for people unable or unwilling to work. He did not need to embellish the language because the single word unwilling carried the entire political problem on its own, and he read it slowly enough that nobody could pretend they had misunderstood what was written. Ocasio-Cortez answered that the document had been a draft released prematurely, but Cruz pressed the obvious weakness in that defense. This was not a random social media post from an anonymous supporter, but material published by her own operation alongside the proposal that defined her national profile. His point was not that staff mistakes never happen, it was that when a defining policy document contains something politically radioactive, blaming the release process does not erase the sentence itself. He flattened the page on the table and treated it as evidence rather than rhetoric, because paper does not care whether the communications team later wishes it had chosen different words. From there, Cruz shifted to jobs, specifically Amazon's 2019 plan to bring roughly 25,000 positions to New York City, with average salaries cited in the script at approximately $150,000. He reminded the room that Ocasio-Cortez had publicly celebrated the collapse of that deal as a victory over corporate greed, a phrase that sounded very different when placed beside 25,000 potential paychecks. Later, when Amazon leased Manhattan office space for roughly 1,500 employees, she again highlighted the development, and Cruz attacked the contradiction with the phrase Instagram math, reducing an ideological argument to the arithmetic difference between 25,000 and 1,500. His point was viciously simple, celebrating the disappearance of tens of thousands of proposed jobs and later taking a victory lap over a fraction of that total may work inside a political narrative, but it looks much weaker when somebody forces the numbers to stand next to each other. The families who might have wanted those salaries were not abstractions in Cruz's framing. They were the missing side of a victory speech. Ocasio-Cortez reached for her water glass and set it back down without drinking, as Cruz returned to the yellow pad and drew a deliberate line through the first item. Then he asked a different question, one that removed climate policy, Amazon, and spending estimates entirely. Could she name one major piece of legislation she had passed, not merely proposed, promoted, or discussed, but actually passed and signed into law? She began by describing herself as a leading voice, but Cruz cut directly through the branding and asked again for one bill, one law, one concrete legislative achievement carrying her name. The answer never arrived, and the silence mattered, because this first stage of the hearing had already exposed the same weakness twice. The public image depended on expertise, scale, confidence, and certainty, while the questions demanded numbers and measurable results. Cruz had crossed out only the first item on the pad, but the structure of the confrontation was already visible. Every broad claim was going to be dragged away from slogans and forced to stand beside something that could actually be counted. Cruz let the silence remain for several seconds because, after a question like that, rushing to fill the room would have weakened the effect, and he understood perfectly well that the absence of an answer was already doing more damage than another paragraph of accusation could possibly do. He was not searching for his next point, not reorganizing his notes, not improvising. He was allowing the committee, the reporters, the cameras, and Ocasio-Cortez herself to sit with the first item now crossed off on the yellow legal pad. Then he changed direction completely and asked whether language matters when people in positions of power use extreme terms, whether words spoken from public office can create consequences beyond the moment in which they are delivered. This was terrain Ocasio-Cortez understood, and she immediately agreed, saying that words from powerful people carry enormous weight before attempting to redirect the criticism toward Republican rhetoric about immigrants and minority communities. Cruz did not follow her there because he was not interested in beginning a new ideological argument. He wanted only the premise, and once she gave it to him, he locked it in. He reminded her of the words attributed to her in June 2019, when she said that the United States was running concentration camps on the southern border, and then he asked the only question necessary for the next stage of the exchange. Did she still stand by those words? Ocasio-Cortez responded by describing children held in terrible conditions, families separated, people sleeping on concrete floors, and detainees lacking basic necessities, facts she used to defend the intensity of the language she had chosen. Cruz stopped her before the explanation could become an escape hatch, and he made a distinction that was far more damaging than simply denying that suffering had occurred. He explicitly acknowledged overcrowding, humanitarian failure, and disgraceful conditions, removing the easiest defense before she could deploy it, because his argument was not that detention conditions were acceptable. His argument was that she had possessed an entire vocabulary of accurate condemnation, and nevertheless selected the two words carrying perhaps the heaviest historical association available. If she had called the facilities overcrowded, he said, he would have agreed. If she had called the situation a humanitarian crisis or a national disgrace, he would have had no trouble standing beside that description. But she had chosen concentration camps, and Cruz's case was that this was not a neutral synonym for bad detention conditions, but a phrase loaded with the memory of systematic imprisonment and extermination, a phrase almost guaranteed to summon specific historical images in the minds of anyone who heard it. That was the pressure point. The issue was no longer whether border conditions deserved outrage, but whether a public official who had just agreed that words matter was willing to accept responsibility for choosing the most explosive words available. Cruz framed the choice as deliberate rather than accidental, not a slip produced by a heated interview, but language delivered publicly to an audience capable of spreading it across the country within minutes. Once he had separated the underlying humanitarian criticism from the terminology used to express it, Ocasio-Cortez could no longer defend the phrase merely by repeating that the conditions had been terrible. Then Cruz introduced Edward Mosberg, the Holocaust survivor described in the original script, and the tone of the exchange tightened immediately because the argument moved away from partisan interpretation and toward the personal weight carried by someone who had actually survived the world those words invoked. Cruz described Mosberg as a man in his 90s who had survived a concentration camp in Austria, who had lived through the destruction of his family, who had carried the evidence of that experience across most of a lifetime, and who had heard Ocasio-Cortez use those words in reference to American border detention facilities. Mosberg, according to the script, did not answer with a television rant or a social media campaign, but with a personal invitation, asking her to visit Auschwitz with him and confront the physical reality behind the terminology she had used. The point was devastating precisely because it required almost no theatrical decoration. A survivor asked a politician to walk through the place whose name had become shorthand for industrialized horror to see the barracks and the machinery of death, rather than relying on metaphor from behind a camera. Cruz then stated that she never accepted the invitation and never responded to the letter, leaving that absence hanging beside her earlier insistence that powerful people must understand the consequences of their language. The room, as the script presents it, became so quiet that ordinary mechanical sounds suddenly felt noticeable, and the silence now carried a different weight from the one produced by the Green New Deal questions, because this was no longer an argument about arithmetic. Ocasio-Cortez tightened visibly and reached for a familiar form of defense, saying that she did not need a lecture from a white man in a suit about suffering endured by marginalized communities because she had experienced and witnessed that suffering herself. Under ordinary political conditions, that move would have forced the other person into a defensive explanation about identity, privilege, or intent, dragging the argument away from the original question until nothing measurable remained. Cruz refused the diversion entirely and lowered his voice instead of raising it, making the correction brutally specific. Edward Mosberg was not the white man in a suit, asking her to understand the weight of those words. The request had come from a Holocaust survivor, and Cruz asked whether she was dismissing him. That question stripped the maneuver of its protective framing because the target of her dismissal was no longer Cruz, no longer a Republican senator, and no longer an abstract political opponent she could place neatly inside an ideological category. The script presents the moment as one in which a familiar political card suddenly landed on the wrong person, colliding not with a partisan talking point, but with the testimony of someone whose authority came from having survived the history under discussion. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth and stopped, while the cameras remained fixed on a reaction that could not be edited into a cleaner sequence or buried beneath another minute of explanation. An aide slid a note toward her. She glanced at it and moved it away, and her pen pressed into the paper in front of her while Cruz returned to the yellow legal pad sitting between them. He drew a second black line through the second item, leaving 2 crossed out and 2 remaining, and by then the pattern Cruz was constructing had become impossible to miss. The first item had challenged the image of the policy expert by demanding costs, numbers, and legislative results rather than slogans, while the second challenged the image of the defender of marginalized people by placing her rhetoric beside a survivor whose objection could not easily be brushed aside as partisan hostility. Different subjects, different defenses, different kinds of evidence, yet the accusation embedded in Cruz's method remained the same. There was a gap between the role performed publicly and the standard applied when that role was tested against something concrete. One unsuccessful answer could be dismissed as a bad exchange, an awkward day, an adversarial question phrased to produce a clip, but 2 collapses in 2 completely different categories made that explanation much harder to sustain. Cruz still had half the legal pad untouched, and the remaining items were about to move away from spending and language altogether, because the next test was aimed at something even more central to Ocasio-Cortez's public identity. It was going to examine the personal story she had repeated for years, the story about where she came from, who she was, and what exactly happened when that carefully polished story met a yearbook, a property record, and a place called Yorktown. Cruz changed his tone before changing the subject, and that shift mattered because the next section of the hearing was not about legislation, historical language, or a disputed phrase pulled from an old live stream. He sounded warmer, slower, almost conversational, as if the cross-examination had briefly ended and what followed was simply curiosity about the personal biography Ocasio-Cortez had repeated across interviews, speeches, campaign appearances, and social media for years. He told her he respected the story she had built around growing up in the Bronx, working as a bartender, coming from a working-class family, and understanding rent, healthcare, and financial pressure from the ground level rather than from a policy memo. The tension visibly eased because this was familiar territory, perhaps the most familiar territory she had, and she began telling the story exactly as she had told it countless times before. Her mother cleaned houses, her father owned a small business, he died while she was in college, she worked as a bartender and waitress, and she understood what it meant to struggle. For a moment, the confrontation looked almost generous, but the yellow legal pad still sat in front of Cruz with 2 items crossed out and 2 remaining, and generosity was not why the 3rd item was there. Cruz listened without interrupting, nodded, and then asked whether she had specifically grown up in the Bronx, whether that was the place where she had spent her childhood and the place that had shaped her identity. Ocasio-Cortez answered that she had been born in the Bronx and began explaining how deeply the Bronx had influenced who she was. But Cruz cut through the biography with a question so ordinary that its effect came almost entirely from what followed. What high school did she attend? There was a brief pause, small enough to disappear in a normal conversation, but obvious enough in a hearing where every second of hesitation was preserved by cameras, microphones, and reporters waiting for the answer. She said Yorktown High School in Westchester County, then immediately tried to place that fact inside the larger story by explaining that her family had maintained strong connections to the Bronx and that she had gone back and forth between the 2 worlds. Cruz repeated the school name slowly and precisely because once Yorktown entered the record, the third item on the pad no longer required a complicated argument. Yorktown Heights was not the Bronx, and Cruz emphasized that distinction by placing the locations beside each other rather than burying the issue beneath accusations about class or authenticity. He cited the Westchester County suburb, the family home on Friends Road, and the fact that Ocasio-Cortez lived there from childhood until she graduated in 2007, all details presented in the original script as evidence against the simpler political shorthand of Bronx Girl. He then turned to the yearbook, which listed her as Sandy Cortez, and used the name not because changing a preferred name is inherently suspicious, but because the physical record had become symbolic of something the campaign biography could not edit after the fact. Cruz's point was not that she had never been born in the Bronx or had no ties there. The attack was narrower and therefore sharper, aimed at the way her political identity repeatedly compressed a more complicated childhood into a cleaner, more useful story. The yearbook, the address, and the school did not need a communication strategy, and that was exactly why they were so dangerous to a biography built through repetition. He referred to people who remembered her from Yorktown and to a state assemblyman who had attended the same high school and later publicly mocked what he called the AOC Bronx mythology, using their memories to reinforce the difference between an image and the record sitting behind it. Then Cruz introduced reactions from Bronx residents quoted in the original script, people who argued that someone could hear the difference between a person raised on those streets and someone who had spent much of childhood elsewhere. That detail deepened the attack because it moved the issue away from Cruz personally deciding whether Ocasio-Cortez was really from the Bronx and toward the people whose identity she had made central to her own political brand. By this point, her posture had tightened again. The relaxed expression from the beginning of the personal story section had disappeared, and the hearing had returned to the same pattern that defined the first two items, a broad public narrative being forced into contact with specific records. Cruz had not changed the underlying structure at all. He had only changed the subject. He reminded her that only moments earlier she had described herself as a girl from the Bronx whose life had been shaped by the borough, then contrasted that sentence with the fact that she had moved to Yorktown as a child and attended school there for years. He cited the language used in an earlier campaign biography referring to a commute between school and family in the Bronx, then noted that the wording had later changed, using the edits themselves as evidence that the story had been repeatedly adjusted as scrutiny increased. The accusation was not that a family moving for better schools constituted wrongdoing, and Cruz made that explicit when Ocasio-Cortez defended her mother's sacrifice and explained that the move to Yorktown had been made because her family wanted a better education for her. For a moment, that answer gave her room to recover because the sacrifice itself was entirely understandable, and Cruz refused to attack it. Instead, he separated the family decision from the political presentation and asked why Yorktown had been minimized or erased from the version of the story presented to the public. That distinction was brutal because it prevented the hearing from becoming an argument over whether working-class families are allowed to move, whether immigrant families can belong to more than one community, or whether someone loses all connection to a birthplace after leaving it. Cruz said nobody was questioning what her mother had done. Nobody was questioning the sacrifice involved, and nobody was claiming that a childhood divided between two places was somehow illegitimate. What he questioned was why the public-facing identity repeatedly used the simpler and more politically useful formulation rather than the fuller explanation she was now offering under pressure. He pointed out that when the yearbook image resurfaced, the response described in the script was not a straightforward acknowledgement followed by an explanation of the move, but a fundraising email turning the challenge to the biography into another political mobilization opportunity. Cruz's framing was merciless because every attempt to defend the story on emotional grounds only returned the argument to the same factual question. If the complicated truth was perfectly defensible, why had the simpler version been sold so aggressively? Then came the Texas comparison, delivered with the same controlled sarcasm he had used earlier when talking about basic arithmetic. Cruz said that if he told people he had grown up in Oklahoma when he had actually grown up in Houston, people would not call that nuanced or authentic. They would call it false, and no amount of branding would change the location written in the records. The line about not fundraising off a yearbook drew the restrained reaction described in the source, the kind of involuntary sound that escapes a press section when the joke lands harder than the people in the room want to admit. Ocasio-Cortez pressed a hand near her collarbone, while Cruz looked down at the legal pad and drew a third line through the third item, leaving only one remaining. By then, the first three challenges had moved through policy, rhetoric, and biography, but Cruz's larger accusation had become increasingly consistent. Every time the public role was tested against something concrete, the performance became harder to maintain. The first role had been the policy expert who could not produce the number Cruz demanded. The second, the defender of the marginalized confronted with the objection of a Holocaust survivor. And the third, the Bronx political identity confronted with Yorktown High School, Friends Road, and a yearbook that could not be rewritten. Cruz treated those three collapses not as unrelated controversies, but as evidence of the same system, a habit of constructing a role for the camera and then resisting the record when the record complicated the role. The word hanging over the hearing now was performance, and Ocasio-Cortez herself would soon use it, accusing Cruz of staging the entire proceeding for political effect. But that accusation would give him exactly the term he needed for the fourth item. Only one line remained uncrossed on the yellow pad, and unlike the first three, it was not about a proposal, a phrase, or a childhood narrative. The final item was about money, bills, a $35,000 event, a dress carrying the words "tax the rich," and the question Cruz was preparing to reduce to the simplest standard of all. When the performance comes with a price tag, who actually pays? Ocasio-Cortez did what she had done whenever the terrain became uncomfortable. She attacked the terrain itself, calling the hearing theater, accusing Cruz of putting on a show for his political base, and insisting that the questions about the Green New Deal, Yorktown, and her public image were simply another performance staged for cameras. Cruz did not object to the word because the word was useful, and instead of defending himself against the accusation, he waited until it sat in the room long enough to become part of the record. Then he asked whether people should pay their bills, a question so elementary that any complicated answer would have sounded ridiculous before it even reached the microphone. Ocasio-Cortez agreed, and when he followed by asking whether elected officials should at least be held to the same standard as everyone they represent, she agreed again. Two simple principles were now established, and Cruz moved immediately to the final item on the yellow pad. He brought up the September 2021 Met Gala, where Ocasio-Cortez appeared in the now famous white dress carrying the words "tax the rich," and then asked whether she had personally paid for the ticket associated with the event. She said that her expenses had been handled through personal funds, but Cruz narrowed the question further and asked specifically about the admission for her partner, refusing to let the answer dissolve into broad references to arrangements made by staff. According to the ethics findings cited in the original script, Cruz said her partner had received free admission, turning what had been presented as a glamorous political statement into a much simpler question about who actually paid the bill. The irony was almost too obvious to require decoration. A public figure had attended one of the most exclusive events in American culture while wearing a message demanding that wealthy people contribute more, yet the hearing was now focused on whether everyone connected to her appearance had fully paid their own way. Cruz did not need to invent the contradiction because the contradiction was sitting in the same frame as the slogan. Then he turned to the dress itself and asked whether she had paid full price for it, again stripping away the symbolism and forcing the discussion toward invoices, discounts, and actual costs. Ocasio-Cortez said she had used personal funds to rent it, but Cruz cited the ethics report described in the script and said the designer had lowered certain costs after intervention from her staff. That was where the slogan became almost self-parodying in his presentation. While the dress told wealthy people to pay more, her own operation had been working to reduce what she had to pay. Cruz let that contradiction breathe because sarcasm was no longer necessary. The visual alone carried the argument more effectively than another speech. Tax the rich had been designed as a political message, but in Cruz's hands, it became a receipt question, and receipt questions are far less forgiving than slogans. The pressure increased when Cruz asked what happened after the ethics inquiry began and who had been blamed for the unresolved payments and arrangements. Ocasio-Cortez referred to a staffer, but Cruz immediately cited testimony in the source script saying that the staffer did not have access to her personal credit card, creating another contradiction between the explanation and the mechanics required for that explanation to be true. He reduced the conflict to two possibilities. Either Ocasio-Cortez's account was wrong, or the staffer's sworn account was wrong, and he asked which one the committee was supposed to believe. She did not provide the clean answer he demanded, and Cruz then seized on the wording of her public response, particularly the promise to remedy remaining amounts rather than simply saying she would pay what was owed. For him, that single word captured the larger problem because ordinary people do not get to rename an unpaid bill when the money comes out of their own pocket. Cruz was not finished with the money trail, and he moved from the Met Gala to campaign expenditures, asking how much her campaign had spent in connection with a Bad Bunny concert in Puerto Rico. When she described it as a campaign event and said she would need to check the amount, Cruz supplied the figure used in the script, approximately $50,000, and then added the other expenditures listed there, including luxury accommodations, payments connected to therapy services, and money for a celebrity makeup artist. His argument was not simply that campaign spending can look extravagant when read aloud. It was that the people supplying the campaign account were often ordinary supporters sending small donations because they believed they were financing a political cause. A $10 or $20 donation looks very different when placed beside luxury travel, entertainment, or cosmetic expenses, especially after years of rhetoric centered on inequality and working class struggle. Cruz therefore shifted the question away from technical compliance and toward whether donors understood what their money was actually supporting. Ocasio-Cortez answered that the expenditures were compliant with campaign finance rules, but Cruz rejected legality as the question he had asked and returned instead to transparency. He offered the image of an elderly retired teacher in Queens sending $20 after watching a video about income inequality, someone who believed that contribution was going directly toward the political fight she had been encouraged to join. Would that donor know that campaign money had been used for the expenses Cruz was describing, and would she still have donated if every line item had been placed beside the contribution button before she clicked it? Ocasio-Cortez did not give him the answer he was seeking, and Cruz used the silence to widen the contrast between fundraising rhetoric and spending records. The point was becoming brutally repetitive without Cruz needing to repeat himself. The public message and the private invoice kept refusing to resemble one another. He leaned back and joked that during his years in the Senate, he had never expensed a concert ticket, not even Willie Nelson, adding that for a Texan, this supposedly required genuine discipline. The room gave the restrained reaction described in the source, but the joke was merely a transition into the closing argument, because Cruz then turned his attention away from Ocasio-Cortez and toward the people watching at home. He described Americans who file their taxes, track grocery bills, calculate prescription costs, split restaurant checks carefully, and understand exactly what money means because every dollar spent is a dollar removed from something else. These people in Cruz's framing did not have staff members arranging discounts, campaign accounts absorbing unusual expenses, or ethics language allowing them to remedy something after investigators discovered a problem. They lived under the ordinary version of accountability, the version where the bill arrives with their own name on it and somebody eventually expects payment. That was the comparison the entire fourth item had been building toward, because Cruz wanted the Met Gala dress to stop being a fashion moment and become evidence of what he portrayed as a double standard. A woman could walk through a $35,000 event wearing "Tax the Rich," yet questions about admission costs, clothing expenses, and outstanding payments could remain unresolved long enough to require an ethics inquiry, while the people being instructed to contribute more were balancing household budgets without any such cushion. Cruz argued that those viewers did not need a senator to manufacture outrage for them because they already understood the difference between a slogan about sacrifice and the experience of actually making one. The message was not complicated, and that was precisely why it worked within the script. Ordinary people pay, ordinary people check receipts, ordinary people answer when someone asks who covered the bill. The question Cruz kept returning to was whether the political class believed the same rules applied when the cameras were pointed in the other direction. Ocasio-Cortez's hands remained against the table while Cruz finally looked down at the legal pad and drew the fourth and final line through the last remaining item. 4 questions had now become 4 black marks, and he turned the pad face down exactly as it had been when she first sat at the witness table, completing the visual structure that had carried the hearing from beginning to end. Then he returned to the word she had thrown at him earlier, performance, and said she had been correct that a performance had taken place in the room, just not the one she had accused him of staging. The accusation underneath the entire hearing was now explicit. The Green New Deal expert, the defender of the oppressed, the Bronx girl, and the tax the rich icon were, in Cruz's framing, roles that weakened whenever specific numbers, documents, records, or bills were placed beside them. What began with a face-down legal pad had ended with every item crossed out and one final claim left standing above everything else. The problem was not the lack of a message, but the distance between the message and the evidence used to sell it. The closing argument pushed beyond Ocasio-Cortez herself and toward the resentment the script claimed many viewers had been carrying for years, the feeling that political figures could survive behavior that would destroy an ordinary employee, taxpayer, or donor. Put the wrong city on a resume, and a normal worker could lose a job, misuse company money, and that worker could be escorted out. Fail to explain the cost of a major project, and no manager would call the failure visionary leadership. Ordinary people did not get fundraising emails when contradictions surfaced. They did not get communications teams to rename mistakes, and they certainly did not get to convert criticism into another opportunity to collect donations. That was why Cruz's final weapons in the script were not ideological theories, but names, numbers, records, and the simplest question in the entire confrontation: who paid the bill? The legal pad was face down, the 4 lines were finished, and the script ended exactly where it had been heading from the opening sentence, with the argument that a performance can survive applause, branding, and social media, but it becomes much harder to maintain when someone forces it to sit still beside the receipt.